Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC74. In today's video I'm gonna talk about my Iflight Xl5 V4 5-inch FPV quad. I did some modifications including waterproofing, as you already could see in the intro of this video, and I'm gonna guide you through all the steps I did and the reason why I changed all these things to, in my opinion, make it a better quad, a safer quad. So let's jump into steps and have a closer look. An important information at the beginning: I didn't buy this from a shop, but I got it from a friend, and he already mounted the TPU mount for the GoPro Hero 7, and he changed the VTX to the TBS Unify Pro 32. That's the reason why it wasn't absolutely stock when I got it, and he also already changed the props, so I just go to mention these changes he already did and go through all the modifications I added to it. The first modification I did is about the GoPro mount. If you use the stock screws, which hold only the top carbon plate and the spacer together, they are pretty short in the spacer because of the thickness of the GoPro mount. And what I did is I changed the short stock screws to longer screws just to increase the strongness of the screws into the spacers, to make sure that the screws cannot be pulled out of the spacers and the spacers or the screws get damaged. I did this for all 4 screws around the GoPro mount just to make everything stronger and secure the camera better on the frame. The capacitor which comes with the kit, this is a 470 microfarad as stock capacitor, and I always use 1000 microfarad capacitors, so I decided to replace the stock capacitor with 1000 microfarad capacitor just to reduce distortions on the system to an absolute minimum. For a clean isolation solution on the capacitor legs, I used some isolation from small cables which are isolated with silicone isolation, and I just cut small pieces of this isolation of the cable and put them over the legs of the capacitor just to have no unisolated area of the legs of the capacitor between the ESC and the capacitor itself. Then I had to do a change on the battery cable just because I use 1800s 4S batteries, and these batteries do not fit on top of the frame just because the stock position of the cable is in this hole here. You get the battery cables out on top of your top plate, and if you put a 1800 battery on it, as you can see, you cover this hole and you cannot use these batteries. So I decided to take a little thinner cables. These are 14 gauge cables, the stock cables are 12 gauge cables, and for the flying style, for cinematic flying and soft freestyle, what I fly, these cables are definitely still thick enough. And I soldered them in a 90-degree angle onto the solder pads of the ESC just to make it possible to get them out of the frame sideways, and I keep them with Velcro tied to the battery, so there's no chance for the cables to get in contact with the propellers. So it's a safe installation, and I think it even keeps the cables better in place than if you have the center outlet of the cable and your cable is moving around on top of the frame. The gold bullet plugs, 4mm gold bullet plugs I use, is just my personal choice. That doesn't change any performance or something, but I prefer this kind of connectors. Most of the pilots use the XT60 system, which works so great. The props I use are the props my friend put it on the quad. These are the Ethix S3 props. These are pretty flat pitch props, and for the high kV motors, these are 2750 kV motors, so pretty high RPM. In my opinion, they work absolutely perfect for cinematics and soft freestyle, perhaps also for hardcore freestyle. I don't fly hardcore freestyle, so cannot tell you anything about this, but for the style I fly, I really like the behavior of the quad. It feels absolutely fantastic in the air, and I have flight time around 3 minutes. That's not that much, but it's okay for me because I don't do any long range or things. It's just mid-range or short range flying. There was a little surprise about the stock pigtail, which is used on the VTX on this frame. The stock pigtail is pretty short, so as you can see, when I hold it at the same place where it sits, it's just long enough to reach the position of the VTX. And because of the antenna mount, which is TPU, you can move this antenna mount. And what happens when you move it, so in case of a crash or if you transport it in your backpack and because of some reason it pushes on your antenna, you pull the pigtail backwards. And what already happened in my case, just by carrying the quad in the backpack, is that I pulled out the MMCX connector out of the VTX. If this happens during a crash and the pigtail is getting out of your VTX, you risk your VTX. So the VTX is getting pretty hot very quickly, and it can burn and damage and be done, and you have to replace your VTX. So I just replaced the pigtail with a longer pigtail, which makes now a small arc here, and like this there is no more issue. You can pull however you want on your antenna, and the pigtail is long enough to keep the connector, the MMCX connector you can see here, perfectly in place and no force on the VTX or on the MMCX connector. Then I also replaced the stock antenna. The antenna worked pretty well, but I just wanted to have an antenna which is a bit longer, just to have it a bit more away from the motors and from the frame to get better reception instead of the stock antenna. For short ranges, the stock antenna is okay too, but if you go for mid-range, it's really an improvement to have a bit longer antenna, which gives you this better reception. The VTX I got with this quad is the TBS Unify Pro 32, and as you can see, it's built with 2 layers of electronic plates, and it's not that easy to make it perfectly waterproof. So I decided to change the VTX to the Furious FPV Tank Mini. This fits absolutely perfect inside, and it's only a single electronics plate, so it's very easy to waterproof it, and it also has maximum output power of 800 milliwatts, so that works absolutely perfect for all the ranges I fly on this quad. And the VTX is also super easy to program. I'm pretty happy with this one. The FPV picture quality is absolutely great with this VTX. Then let's talk about the whole waterproofing of the quad. The target was to really have it 100% waterproof. So you can take the quad, you can put it underwater, take it back out, and the quad will still work. That was the target, just because I want to fly in snowy conditions, in extreme cases in rainy conditions, and also want to have a dive at the waterfall where the quad can get really wet. That was the target, and that's the reason why I did the waterproofing like I show you now. Two components were from my last 5-inch quad. It was the Armaton Marmot. I crashed this recently in the Swiss mountains. And the VTX and the RC receiver were already waterproofed on the Armaton Marmot, so I just had to take them out, put it back in here. On the VTX I had to uncover the solder points to solder on the new wires from this quad to the VTX, but nothing else to do with the VTX and the RC receiver. The components I had to waterproof from the beginning were the FPV camera, the FC and the ESC. First it was time to take apart the stack, so I had to unscrew all the stuff and unsolder the motor cables just to get access to the bottom side of the ESC to make all the components absolutely waterproof. For my waterproofing jobs I always use Plasti Dip Liquid Tape. That works absolutely perfect. And what I recently figured out that it's really recommended to use a thinner for Plasti Dip Liquid Tape. Stock it's pretty thick and you don't need the Plastidip to be that thick layer on your electronics. So I tried the Mibenco Thinner, which works absolutely great for all Plastidip products. And like this you can tune the thickness of the liquid tape and you can really put thin layers on your electronics, which looks way cleaner, and it's no problem at all in case of waterproofing. And you also get easier access to the solder points if you have to unsolder or resolder some cables in case of a crash, if you have to replace any components. And that worked really great on this job. It was a real improvement in comparison to my first waterproofing job with Plastidip Liquid Tape. So I started with the bottom side of the ESC and I did the same on all components, all the electronic components on the ESC and on the FC, also on the VTX, which get hot, were clear from Plastidip Liquid Tape. I just put the liquid tape all around these components, for example the FETs on the ESC, just to make sure that they still can breathe, that they still get enough cool air to not overheat your ESC, your FC or your VTX. Like this, you're absolutely sure that also on a hot summer day your electronics won't overheat and kill your quad. What is really important if you do the waterproofing like I did is that you do a check after the first layer if really everything is covered perfectly. I recommend to use a bright light and check if there are any shiny surfaces underneath the Plastidip which come through the Plastidip, so which are not perfectly covered. Then you can put a second layer of Plastidip onto it. I had to do this on the ESC and on the camera. On the camera there were some spots which were pretty big holes on the surface, so I really had to close these holes completely. And like this, after the second layer, I was absolutely sure that there is no more spot which is open and which can make troubles in case of a really wet quad. For the USB connector of the FC, I always use these silicone blind plugs, which are a great solution. You just put them into your USB connector, and after you put it in, you can cover the silicone plug and the USB connector with Plastidip Liquid Tape. Like this, you also avoid water inside your USB plug, and at the same time you avoid to get Plastidip inside the USB plug, which makes it impossible to still put in the USB cable. If you want to program your FC, you just can pull out the blind connector, the silicon blind connector, put in your cable, program your quad, put the plug back in, recover it with Plasti Dip Liquid Tape, and you're ready for wet conditions. I also highly recommend to cover every connector which connects the components together. For example, the connector from the FC to your ESC with all the signal wires and the power wires. If you don't do this, you can never be sure to get in trouble if your quad gets wet. So it's only 100% sure that your quad will work in any wet conditions if you cover everything. And it's absolutely no problem to remove the connectors out of the plugs of the components of the FC or the ESC. You just need to pull a little more on the connector, not on the cables, just on the connector, and you can get them easily out of the plugs. And like this you can do whatever you want to change your components, put the connector back in, recover it with Plastidip, and you're good to go. That's the same for every connector, if it's the USB or camera connector, VTX or whatever you connect and not solder onto your components. After covering all the components and the whole Plastidip is completely cured, you can rebuild your stack, solder on the motor cables. It's just important to not cover your solder points before you solder on your cables, just because you have to clean the pads and then solder on. And at the end you have still great access to the solder spots of your motor cables, so you can cover them after soldering with Plastidip, and then everything is covered absolutely perfect. One little modification I forgot to mention, it's about the FPV camera. On this frame you have 5 different positions where you can install your camera, and the stock position is on the front center hole. And what I did is I used the upper hole on the front. I hoped to get the props a little bit more out of the picture. They are almost in a center position of your FPV picture, and with moving the camera a bit up you can lower the props in your FPV picture. Not a big deal, just an idea I tried, and you cannot get them out of your picture. They are just a little lower in your FPV picture, but it doesn't make a big difference. But I just wanted to try if I can improve the FPV picture or clean it and don't have the props in the picture anymore. Then it was time for the water check. I did this in my kitchen, just turn on the water and turned on the quad, the whole system, and put the quad under the water and let it run for 1 or 2 minutes and checked if the whole system works. Also with the monitor to check the FPV picture, if I get still perfect live picture without any distortion, and everything went absolutely perfect during the test. I also did arming test and FC function test with moving around the quad to check if the FC has any strange functions or if he works as it should. And I did also stick input test, just also here to check if everything reacts like you want to have it. On all such tests, just make sure that you remove your props. The risk of getting hurt of your props is pretty high, and you never know how your quad reacts. You don't know if your waterproofing was perfect. So with like on every test you do on Betaflight programming or whatever, just remove your props, do the waterproofing test, and if something reacts strange, just take the quad back apart, cover a second layer or a third layer if it doesn't work after the second layer. And for me, I already did 2 quads and both work absolutely perfect. At the crash of my Armaton Marmot, it even fell into the water of a little river, and the quad worked absolutely perfect even after the crash. Just the frame was broken, one motor was damaged, and the GoPro and the FPV camera were damaged. But the whole stack, the VTX, the RC receiver, everything was absolutely perfect, and it was around, I don't know, 5 minutes or something down on the bottom of the river, and the whole electronics were absolutely in perfect conditions. So again, I really can recommend to use Plasti Dip Liquid Tape. I know that there are other solutions on the market like conformal coating. I have no idea about these systems. I saw different results, some were good, some were bad, but with Plasti Dip Liquid Tape, my experience is really a good one. Never had an issue with it, so try it, and I'm pretty sure that you will be happy with this waterproofing solution. This is all about the mods on my Iflight Xl5 V4 FPV quad. I hope you liked the video. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.